Hi guys, welcome back to another video. I'm Gids. Thank you so much for joining me in today's video. So today's video, I'm asking the question, are fragrance brands going through an identity crisis? Now, I was having a conversation with a friend and we were talking about fragrances, a fellow fragrance enthusiast. And I was just mentioning to my friend that I just feel at the moment there isn't anything which I've smelled or that of late, which has really excited me or grabbed my attention. And my friend agreed and said everything has become a bit underwhelming. Again, this is just my personal opinion. We were just having an honest conversation and we were just sort of saying that things are changing. A lot of fragrances are starting to smell very similar. And I understand there are certain fragrance trends which brands jump on, and then things all kind of feel like they're starting to become much of the same, but just different versions. Now, I know in fragrance, as with fashion and other things, there's lots of imitations. People are inspired by different things, and there are different trends. So brands are going to jump on that, especially if they want to make some money. Now, let's kick off with this first of all. Now, there has been a huge explosion in fragrance. The industry is growing and it's growing fast. Last year alone in the UK, they did 2 billion. The fragrance industry as a whole did over £2 billion in sales. Now that is massive, and it's only going to keep growing. Also, another thing that we have to look into is that the way people wear and experience fragrance has changed. It's completely changed. The landscape has changed, and that has been one of the biggest shifts. People no longer just wear a fragrance for the sake of wearing a fragrance, like a signature fragrance. People wear a fragrance to express their individuality, who they are, what they believe, their position in the world. Like, people now use everything to truly express the essence of who they are. That's kind of where we are, I think, as a society, as a global culture as well, especially when we look at the growing market, which is Gen Z. Now, for Gen Z, and this is really interesting, when I was doing my research on this topic, Gen Z alone, 83% of them have stated that they wear fragrance at least 3 times a week, which I think is really interesting. And that age group represents a massive growth in the market. If you look on things like TikTok and social media, particularly TikTok, or they now call it perfume talk or perfume TikTok or fragrance TikTok, it's huge. And I remember having a conversation with a colleague, and this colleague was saying to me when I was talking about fragrance, because they know I'm into fragrance, they said, oh yeah, I've seen some things on TikTok, and there was one fragrance that I purchased. It was an affordable Middle Eastern fragrance. And of course, that speaks to how impactful TikTok is when it comes to fragrance. It is massive. There are so many people searching for fragrances on TikTok. The amount of videos alone on like Louis Vuitton Imagination and a lot of these Middle Eastern fragrances is astounding. Now, I'm going to come back to Gen Z in just a moment, but what's really interesting as well is more of us are purchasing fragrances online than ever before. And that includes blind buying fragrance. So traditionally, a lot of people would go into a store, or they would buy fragrances that perhaps their mother had worn or their father had worn, or very generational fragrances, very iconic, classic fragrances. Now the idea of wearing a fragrance is more about, I'm trying to say this, or I want to communicate this about myself. So it's more about personal expression. It's all about a mood as well that some people are trying to convey through their fragrance. Fragrance brands, I would say, are increasingly stepping away from rigid gender binaries. Now, I found this really, really interesting. So there are more cultural conversations around identity and inclusion. And things like genderless or unisex perfumes are gaining traction, and they're having a massive, massive moment. Now, with the sort of Gen Z, as I said, who are rejecting sort of traditional classifications of fragrance in favor of individuality, brands are now responding to that. And I think it's now creating a massive shift of a lot of brands who are perhaps used to operating in a particular way. You can't just operate in the same way. The world is changing. Consumers are changing. The way people purchase are changing. The reason why people wear fragrance is changing. As I said, the idea of having a signature scent and just wearing that signature scent for the rest of your life, that pretty much does not exist anymore. People now are more expressive. Perhaps one day they want to wear something which uplifts them because, quite frankly, the world at the moment is very dark, or they want to have something which expresses a particular part of their personality or who they're trying to be. We have all these classifications now of fragrance. We've got the clean fragrances, we've got the old money fragrances, we've got the Middle Eastern fragrances. We have all of these different classifications, which I didn't think we had before. We've always had olfactory groups and families like the sheeps and the different types of fragrance categories, but we've never really had particularly like a category which is trying to really essentially group a bunch of individuals within that category. So people that, for example, want to smell wealthy, want to smell rich. I mean, if you look on YouTube, the amount of videos that people have made talking about how to smell rich, how to smell expensive, how to smell wealthy is astounding. And people love those videos because people want to smell expensive, people want to smell rich. Now, I don't necessarily think anymore people care so much about fragrance notes and what fragrances smell like. And hear me out. I know you're probably thinking, no, I care about what a fragrance smells like, but I do feel that if people think a fragrance is going to make them smell expensive, it doesn't necessarily matter as much what it smells like. People are going to buy into that. The other thing I found really, really interesting is that this generation of Gen Z also really care more about things like sustainability, how a fragrance is made. They want to know who the founders are. They want to know more the story of the brand. So a lot of brands are also trying to convey some sort of story around their brand. Even if they're newer brands, they want to have an essence of standing for something, being ethical, being sustainable, having, a way of conveying a story, emotions and moods. So it's very interesting how things are shifting. Now, classic brands, and I've got a few of them here. I've got Tom Ford. And when I think of the House of Tom Ford, I think this is a really, really interesting brand because it's a designer brand. And I remember when I bought Black Orchid and I thought, wow, this fragrance is incredible. There is nothing like Black Orchid. But when I look at the House of Tom Ford now and what they're putting out and the rate of what they're putting out, I think it's astounding. I think last year alone, there were 6,000 releases in 2025. And I believe the reason for that is because these brands are trying to launch so many fragrances because they realize the fragrance industry is growing. So if we release as many fragrances as possible, hopefully we can capture some of that market and we can make a lot of money. Now, I don't necessarily think that approach always works for every brand. I think there are some very classic heritage brands, and I think it hurts their brand if they release too many fragrances. I personally love the House of Chanel. I think they get it so right when it comes to their fragrances because they don't launch too many fragrances, because I think that would devalue and water down what the fragrance house represents, which is luxury, elegance, classic heritage, all of those wonderful things. But when I think of, Tom Ford, I can't even keep up with the amount of fragrances the house has launched, for an example. And I also don't think, in my humble opinion, the fragrances that they're currently launching are that well thought out. It almost feels like we need to release a certain number of fragrances. Let's keep releasing more. Let's keep releasing more. And let's try and tick every type of category of fragrance possible. Also, the question is the answer for these brands to just launch as many fragrances as possible, as quickly as possible, in order to hopefully capture a share of that market? Or is it better for them to really understand this market and to really release things which will appeal to them and are more considered, and find interesting ways to market to them, to sell to them, and to talk to them? So do you think that fragrance brands are going through an identity crisis? Personally, I think they are. And I think there's no harm in brands shifting how they target consumers, how they speak to consumers, how they evolve and move forward. But I think the question is, how do brands evolve and move forward, particularly niche brands, indie brands, without losing the essence of who they are? I don't want to keep talking about overconsumption. I've made videos about that in the past, but I do think the brands, the fragrance houses, are really going through this identity crisis, and there's nothing wrong with them evolving and changing. You know, I think of the House of Creed, and I definitely feel like they're trying to go in a more modern direction with their fragrances, but still retain the classic heritage. And I think it's really interesting. I think a lot of brands are going to go through this as they change, as the market changes, and as it continues to grow. It has exploded. The other thing that's absolutely massive as well is the Middle Eastern fragrances. As we know, there are a number of people who do not want to spend high premiums on fragrances, you know, above two, three, £400. There are a lot of people that will, ironically, there are increasingly a lot of people who are spending that money on fragrances, but there are also a large number of people who do not. So then the question is, how are the brands going to tackle that? I definitely also think there is a bit of a gray market where brands can definitely get in and be between that sort of 150 to £200 range. Also, the question is the answer for these brands to just launch as many fragrances as possible, as quickly as possible, in order to hopefully capture a share of that market? Or is it better for them to really understand this market and to really release things which will appeal to them and are more considered, and find interesting ways to market to them, to sell to them, and to talk to them? Share with me your opinions down below, and hopefully I will see you back for my next video very, very soon. Take care.